Back in 2015, when world leaders and politicians in the U.S. were fear-mongering about, quote, Iranian aggression and this made-up fantasy that they're trying to get a nuclear weapon to be a world menace, the world agreed to the Iran nuclear deal, a peace agreement that was meant to de-escalate tensions. Contrary to popular opinion in Washington, the Iranian government didn't just agree to limit their nuclear program and agree to invasive international inspections of the nuclear facilities for no reason. There were incentives in that deal that we all agreed to in order to get Iran to comply with the deal. One of those incentives was the promise that eventually, in 2020, if Iran was proven to follow the terms of the nuclear deal, the UN would lift the international arms embargo on Iran, which would make it legal for them to buy and sell weapons. Now, as a shock to no one, the neocons and the corporate Democrats, at the direction of AIPAC, wrote a letter this week to the UN, basically begging them to continue the arms embargo with Iran. Now, if you read the letter that was written by, I think it's the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House, this is just a clear attempt, open attempt, to do everything we can to limit Iran's influence in the region so that U.S. imperialism and Israeli imperialism can continue unabated. Now, something that came as a surprise to a lot of people is that Ilhan Omar, of all people, co-signed this letter that was directed by AIPAC. This story is very nuanced and complex. The reason that's given as to why Ilhan Omar co-signed this letter is because she is principally against weapon sales to human rights abusers. It doesn't matter who they are. At the moment, I take her at her word because this is a consistent position that she's had throughout her time in Congress. Ilhan Omar is a refugee from Somalia who knows what it's like to live in a war-torn country, who seen up close, seen firsthand the damage of what happens when human rights abusers are allowed to buy and sell weapons. So if Ilhan Omar's personal position, her principal position is, like I said, I'm against all arms sales to human rights abusers, including Iran, so I am against lifting the UN arms embargo. That was her position. I disagree with her, but she's entitled to her opinion. Where she is dead wrong, and it's completely inexcusable, is signing on to that warmongering neocon AIPAC letter written by the leadership of the Democratic Party in the House. Let me read you some of the lines from this ridiculous letter so you get a understanding of how just insane it is. Quote, UN Security Council Resolution 2231 bans arms transfer to and from Iran, yet Iran routinely violates this resolution with impunity, particularly in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Iran's illicit transfer of weapons directly contributes to some of the most destabilizing threats to the United States and our partners in the Middle East, such as Israel and the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Even so, the resolution serves as an important means to restrain the sales of weapons to Iran and makes clear continued international resolve to stop Iran's illicit weapons transfers. Okay, that's the letter that Ilhan Omar signed on to. So like I said, you have a principal position against the arms sales, that's your opinion, but you sign on to this letter, that's a completely different discussion we're having now. That letter literally accuses Iran of destabilizing Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Oh, really? It was Iran who destabilized those countries. It wasn't the U.S. when Bush started the illegal war in Iraq and killed 1 million civilians and created a breeding ground for jihadists in the Middle East like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. That didn't destabilize Iraq. It's Iran. It wasn't the U.S. giving weapons to rebels and training rebels aligned with ISIS, arming them too, in Syria that destabilized the region in an attempt to overthrow Assad, the president of the country. No, that didn't destabilize Syria. It's Iran. In Yemen, it wasn't the fact that Obama, at the behest of Saudi Arabia, starts a genocide, the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet right now. It wasn't that destabilized Yemen. It's Iran selling weapons to the rebels in Yemen. It's Iran providing military support to the Syrian government. It's Iran aligning with Shia militias in Iraq to fight back ISIS. That's what's destabilizing the region. Come on, that's silly. And I'm not out here defending Iran. I said every one of those countries, Iran has committed war crimes, and it should be investigated. But this letter is just continuing the narrative that it's Iran that's the big bad threat. They're the number one bad guys around the world, and they're destabilizing the region. And that's just not true. And it's even more hypocritical that this letter is coming from the U.S., who is more responsible for the destabilization in these countries than literally anybody else in the planet. So this is absurd. This is obscene. And you have Ilhan Omar, one of the leading progressives, especially on foreign policy, signing on to this ridiculous warmongering letter. Why? When you sign on to a letter like this, it isn't like a vote in the House where they might sneak in some provisions that you like, and but mostly it's a bad bill. But you know what? You have to make a choice, and you want those provisions, so you go ahead and you vote with it. That's not what this is. This is just a letter expressing an opinion and a view of the situation in the Middle East. And like I said, you can have your principled objection to selling weapons to Iran. But when you sign onto that letter, you agree to every single word that's in that letter, and that all the entire letter is nothing but the tools of the military-industrial complex, the people taking orders from AIPAC, the neocons in both parties who have pushed U.S. imperialism and illegal military intervention throughout the Middle East, trying to blame Iran for all of the destabilization and pressuring the international community to be even more antagonistic to Iran. It's just ridiculous. It's ridiculous and it's inexcusable. Ilhan Omar needs to come out and publicly address why she signed that letter. Why she signed that letter, why she agreed to that without any pushback, without any criticism for the warmongering and the neocon propaganda in that letter. She just signs onto it, with no caveats, no amendments, nothing. So she needs to answer for that, because if you actually agree with those ideas that are in that letter, you aren't as non-interventionist as you claim to be. Because all of that is just pretext and warmongering to justify aggressive action towards Iran. And it's not just, we're going to be more belligerent. This is just another step in a series of events where we continue to provoke them towards a military confrontation. And if Ilhan Omar doesn't see what this is, I don't know what to say. She just signed onto it saying, yes, I agree with every word in this letter. And that's insane. Now, take the AIPAC letter out of the equation for a second. Just a quick second. If Ilhan Omar had the policy position that no matter what the Iran nuclear agreement says, I don't care what the situation is, I'm not going to support weapon sales to human rights abusers, and that includes Iran. That was her policy position on this issue. I would have to say I disagree with her, but I couldn't say she's just wrong, because she's experienced things in her life that are influencing this decision that I can never even imagine. If weapon sales to human rights abusers is her red line and she's not budging an inch on it, she's entitled to her opinion on that. I want to just talk about the idea of continuing this arms embargo, despite the fact that everybody agreed in the Iran nuclear deal that it would be lifted in 2020. Every step of the way since this deal was signed, the neocons in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have made it their life's mission to do everything they can to try to blow up this nuclear deal. We put sanctions on Iran, assassinated their top military commander, and yet, despite all of that, Iran has been incredibly reasonable, and they've continued to follow the guidelines of this nuclear agreement, even after Trump did all those things and officially pulled out of the agreement. They've allowed people from the International Atomic Energy Agency to do over a dozen inspections of their nuclear facilities, and every single one of them showed Iran was in compliance with the deal. And continuing this, and if the UN were to continue this arms embargo, it would just be another step inching us closer towards an all-out war with Iran, because we're doing, at literally every turn, we're doing everything possible to provoke them to the point where literally every single obligation we had in the deal, we flagrantly violated, and yet expect Iran to just comply with it. If you guys have been listening to the show for a while, you know my position on this. The idea that Iran was some type of nuclear threat before 2015, when the deal was reached, was an entirely manufactured narrative to push for regime change in Iran. Even though that was the case, Obama got Iran to agree to this nuclear deal to lessen tensions between the countries and open up trade and open up Iran to the rest of the world. The way that we've behaved every step along the way since we signed this deal is making it crystal clear to everyone around the world, as if Libya wasn't a prime enough example. We're making it clear to everyone around the world, do not believe us when we make agreements to deal with nuclear proliferation. Do not believe us when we sign international agreements that deal with the production and use of nuclear weapons. And that's incredibly dangerous, because if we continue on the path that we're on now, where several different countries around the world possess enough nuclear weapons to destroy the entire planet, and nobody can trust an international agreement for nuclear disarmament, that leaves us in a position where all these countries are going to continue to have nuclear weapons, maybe even make more nuclear weapons. And at some point, it is entirely inevitable, whether it's in a year from now, 10 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, at some point, someone is going to set off a nuclear exchange and destroy all life on the planet. So this is bigger than just Iran itself. This is yet another strong and clear example that we're sending to the world. Do not trust us when we make nuclear agreements. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Ilhan Omar's principal objection to just to allowing human rights abusers to buy and sell weapons. Now, I agree that human rights abusers should not be allowed to buy and sell weapons. That includes the US, Saudi Arabia, Israel, the UK, France, Canada, 75% of the world's dictators that the US currently arms and financially backs. None of those human rights abusers should be allowed to legally buy and sell weapons. In theory, I agree with that for Iran too. They're also human rights abusers. But the reality of the situation is a little bit more complicated than that, because if you just say, all right, I'm against selling weapons to human rights abusers, so I'm going to go along with this clearly neocon concocted plan to single out Iran for continuing the weapons embargo, I would think she takes that position because human rights abusers getting weapons obviously means more deaths of civilians. But the reality is, a lot of the time when Iran buys and sells weapons to their allies in countries around the world and across the Middle East, it's to provide pushback to the direct actions of U.S. imperialism. And when you limit Iran's ability to buy and sell weapons with an embargo, that fuels U.S. imperialism in the Middle East, because Iran is literally the main source of pushback. So yes, in Syria, when Iran was aligned with Assad and they were fighting the rebels, they were fighting ISIS, they killed a whole lot of civilians, and they should definitely be held accountable for that. And there should be war crimes investigations with penalties. But the reality is, if they didn't do that, if they weren't fighting ISIS, who was backed by the US and our allies like Turkey and Saudi Arabia, those jihadists would have taken over Syria, done a mass genocide and slaughtering of all the Shia Muslims in the region, and anybody who wasn't Salafist, Wahhabist, fundamentalist, and that would lead to even more deaths. And the same it applies to Iran's actions in Iraq and also in Yemen. Now, this isn't in any way me just giving a green light to sell Iran all the weapons they want and let them do whatever they want because they're fighting U.S. imperialism. That's not what I'm saying at all. But the reality is, you limit Iran's ability to buy and trade weapons, it equals even more civilian casualties from U.S., Saudi Arabia, and Israeli imperialism. So I'm fine with the UN lifting the arms embargo on Iran. Mostly because that's what we all agreed to in the Iran nuclear deal. But the fact that they're the only pushback to U.S., Israeli, Saudi imperialism in the region is the factor that some people might consider.